Welcome to The Guilty Files, a podcast that rips the story open. One crime, two hosts, and truths that don't fit neatly into the box. It's messy, it's real, and it's all on the table. Now, let's open this week's file. Welcome back to The Guilty Files. Here we are, Dani. Another week has gone by. We're here to talk about another case. John Wayne Gacy. Wow, what a case to talk about. There was definitely a lot of things going on there. What was your favorite part of diving into this case this week? Did you have anything that stuck out to you above all else that you really enjoyed?
I really liked this week thinking about theorizing and spending some time contemplating whether or not Gacy committed these crimes by himself or with additional support, other characters in play to this narrative and storyline. That was a really enjoyable angle to theorize about and spend some time with.
I always feel a little weird saying, what did you enjoy? What did you like? Because we're talking about 33 people who were murdered. I think there is a point in true crime where you have to have a little bit of comic relief. You have to have a little fun with these cases, because my entire episode is just me going through and narrating all the cold, hard facts of these cases. And it can be a little dark and a little daunting to dive into that kind of stuff that way. So I really love to get to your episode where you're reimagining things, you're rewriting certain things, you're bringing up these amazing questions and queries, looking into technology and all those things that you do. I think that's one of my favorite parts about doing this show, is that I get to move away from just the cold, hard facts and some of the things that really bog you down and really make you depressed, honestly. If you hear some of these horrific ways that these kids died, it's a horrible case, but having a little bit of fun, there's nothing wrong with that when it comes to true crime. That's what this show is really all about for us, is lightening it up a little bit, talking about some of the things that we enjoyed, but above all, having a little bit of fun while we're doing it.
Exactly. Yeah, the format of this show was really specific for us, and we spent a lot of time working it, testing it, trying to figure out a way in which we could deliver our individual episodes, bring the facts and the seriousness that these cases and these victims especially deserve, as well as exploring things a little bit without getting too out there, without going too far with fictionalizing or dramatizing something in the sense that it takes away the enjoyment that most true crime fanatics have, which is a genuine and authentic interest in not only the specific cases, but also just an interest in reality, in facts, having something that anchors and grounds these stories. We were intentional in setting up your episodes, then intentional in setting up my episodes, creating the space between them. We wanted to be intentional in not doing it all in one episode or one segment, or not trying to cram it all in or lose the intentional approach. Then we wanted to bring in this third kind of co-hosted episode where we've already done the legwork. We've already put in the hours, the effort in our individual episodes. We definitely don't want to become repetitive in the sense where this isn't entertaining. We definitely don't want to be repetitive in a sense where we're not adding to or bringing additional value to the podcast and to what we're delivering to our listeners and fans. So our hope is that the format of our 3 episodes will deliver all of that, but in very succinct and specific, intentional ways. Since this week is our co-hosted episode, we're still trying to find a little bit of our vibe and our banter here in the studio, right? This is our 3rd episode and our first co-hosted show that we're really formatting and working on together. We're going to try something a little bit different this week, and we're going to continue to flesh out the format and segments of this co-hosted show, especially. I think our individual episodes are working phenomenally well. We want to push this co-hosted episode to where I really think it can deliver and be of the caliber show that we're hoping for. Why don't you introduce the first segment and first icebreaker, entertainment approach of adding some, what's the word, levity?
Levity, yes.
To this, and see how it goes over. Show us some grace, stick with us, definitely give us your feedback and let's see what happens.
All right, folks, we're going to kick this off. It's one of our favorite segments that we've fleshed out for this. It's called If They Tweeted. This is where we ask the hard-hitting questions that no true crime investigator ever thought to. What would the key players in this week's case be tweeting if they lived in today's social media age? It's ridiculous, and it's also good fun.
Exactly, because nothing says deep dive into a horrifying case like imagining a 280-character cringe fest from the world's most infamous criminal minds. So let's take a scroll through this fictional timeline of our guy this week, John Wayne Gacy. Or he might have been called Pogo the Clown 69 on Twitter.
Twitter?
It's Twitter, but neither one of us really use Twitter socially or in our personal lives. So typically when it comes to social media or things that you or I really find to be quite ridiculous in this day and age, around our house, we typically name things some funny offhanded just to make fun and light of it since we don't really use it. So yeah, we're not Twitter official users ourselves. So it's Twitter.
It's Twitter, Pogo the Clown 69 on Twitter.
All right. So since you introduced, I'll go first. This is my take on if they tweeted. Pogo the Clown 69 would have tweeted, here's the quote, "Nothing like hosting a backyard barbecue with 400 of your closest friends. Burgers, beer, and oh yeah, don't go in the crawl space. Hashtag neighborhood hero."
And I can just see the local police department's reply now. Our crawl space K9 units would like a word.
That actually makes me think of when I was waiting for my academy class to start. I was stationed at Mounted Patrol. In Atlanta, the Mounted Patrol facility also hosted the K9 unit training facility. So sometimes when I would be at work, I would get to see the K9 units come over and train and work with their dogs. And they did some really neat stuff. And they definitely could crawl through a crawl space.
Yeah, I interviewed for K9 towards the end of my career at Atlanta. And alas, they did not pick me to be a K9 officer, unfortunately for them.
I don't know about that. I've seen the way you train, quote unquote, our dogs around here. So those skills might need to be developed a little bit more. But I'm confident in your skills here. So it's your turn. Let's see. What would you think, Brian, Pogo the Clown 69 would tweet?
I'm picturing Pogo Gacy at his clown gigs tweeting killer clown skills, but not in the way you think. Winky face. Pogo's here to make your party unforgettable. Trust me. Hashtag booked and busy.
I like the hashtag, absolutely. And the FBI's verified account, mind you, would reply, "Unforgettable, huh? Check your DM." Like your use of the emojis. You're not a big emoji user in real life. You make fun of me. Usually if you get an email from Paranormal World Productions Studio, you can really verify, this is some inside intel, investigative intel you can use. If it has a smiley face, a winky emoji, or even if I use the old school actual colon and parenthesis for a smiley face, it's probably me, not Brian.
Yeah, it's definitely not going to be me. I'm not a big emoji guy at all. But clearly, Pogo the Clown 69 is a big emoji guy.
I got one more for you before we close this segment out. Gacy's Twitter bio would definitely say, quote, "Just a clown trying to make people smile. DM for crawl space tours."
That is so dark and so fucked up. But I can tell you, I would be in line for a tour. I'm not going to lie.
Me too. Totally agree. All right. Thanks for having some fun with us, guys. Let's get into the case file of this week. So obviously it's John Wayne Gacy. Let's reintroduce the case a little bit since we had some fun. Do a little quick refresher with our audience. How about that?
Definitely. This is one of the most infamous cases in true crime history. The story of John Wayne Gacy, it's the name that has become synonymous with horror. I want to start by stepping back in and giving you a little bit of context about the case. The case unfolded in the 1970s at a time when societal norms were shifting and law enforcement were still developing many of the tools that we take for granted today. Gacy operated under the guise of normalcy, a respected community member in Chicago who threw block parties, he ran a construction business, and even performed, as we've been joking about, as Pogo the Clown for kids at birthday parties and other things around town. So he was a pretty well-known figure. But behind that facade was a man responsible for the deaths of at least 33 young men and boys. From an investigative perspective, this case is certainly fascinating. The challenges that law enforcement faced, and it highlighted the procedural limitations and cultural blind spots that we've talked about in other cases in the past. For example, Gacy's use of manipulation, his ability to gain the trust of the people that he came in contact with so effortlessly. It was almost like a superpower that this guy had. He knew how to target his young victims. They were mostly young men in vulnerable situations, and he exploited both their circumstances and the societal indifference in those certain communities. Now, the one thing that still amazes me is how the physical evidence started piling up. Think about it. This is before DNA profiling. Investigators had to rely on their grit, intuition, and small but telling clues, like his car logs and receipts found inside his home. And then there's that chilling detail. 26 bodies found buried under the crawl space in his house. If that doesn't pull you into the horror of this case, I don't know what will. But here's the kicker. What if modern technology had been available back then? If Gacy's behavior had triggered those red flags earlier? That's something we're going to explore later in the episode. But for now, Dani, I know you have a completely different angle that you want to bring to the table on this case.
You're right. What makes this case stick with me isn't just the procedural challenges, but the psychological and emotional weight of it all. Let's start with Gacy himself. We're talking about a man who lived a dual life, upstanding citizen by day and sadistic predator by night. Psychologists often look at cases like Gacy's through the lens of repression and identity. He was juggling the societal expectations of being this clean-cut, likable guy with darker compulsions he clearly couldn't or wouldn't control. It's terrifying to think about how that internal chaos manifested outwardly in such horrifying ways. But what really hits me? The victims. These were young men, many from marginalized backgrounds like runaways, struggling with homelessness or just looking for a chance to make a better life for themselves. Society failed them long before Gacy got to them. They were invisible to a system that didn't prioritize their safety or their well-being. And Gacy knew that. He picked his victims because he knew people wouldn't ask too many questions if they disappeared. Brian, you mentioned the crawl space, but for me, that detail is a stark symbol of how disposable these victims were treated, not just by Gacy, but by society at large. It makes me wonder, if Gacy were alive today, would we be better equipped to spot and protect his victims? Or would the same systematic issues still let people like him slip through the cracks? And speaking of cracks, I know we're going to talk later about how law enforcement at the time could have caught him sooner. But before we get there, I've got a question for you. What do you think made Gacy so confident that he could live this double life for as long as he did? Because to me, his arrogance is almost as terrifying as the crimes themselves.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It was Gacy's ability to present himself as a community leader and a trusted figure. And it reminds me of how predators exploit institutional trust. Having worked in policy and traffic enforcement, I've seen how a uniform or even just a confident demeanor can disarm people. Let's talk about how society grants undue authority to individuals who look the part. Think about how often people blindly trust someone just because they're wearing a uniform or have a title, or maybe they just have a really confident demeanor. It's easy to forget how that charm can be a tool for control. Dani, in your community work, did you see people just letting their guard down around the friendly types, or even where there were red flags?
I think we both actually saw this, and I can think of several examples that we would agree on that we experienced together later on in our career, where someone with power or authority, especially in a uniform or with a badge, gave this false sense of security, and people would let their guard down around them. And you and I would be absolutely baffled as how some of these people could maintain positions of power, especially within the police department where we worked. But it's definitely not isolated to just our experiences and within policing. When you give someone power over others, whether it's a coach, a mentor, or a community leader, it creates this blind spot where people assume they're safe. Speaking of the role of charm and authority in manipulation, it's fascinating and horrifying how Gacy used charm to hide his darkness. Having worked, like you mentioned, in community policing, I've met people who are incredibly persuasive even while hiding destructive behaviors. The way Gacy performed kindness as Pogo the Clown reminds me of how manipulation often starts, which is with trust. And the scariest part is how predators build trust first. It's a very strategic decision that they choose to employ. Gacy wasn't a monster in the alley, he was the friendly guy next door, which made him even more dangerous. I personally used to think that charm was harmless until I saw how quickly it could turn into control in high-risk neighborhoods. That was something that my experience in policing helped me learn and grow and understand a little bit deeper. But from a sociologist perspective, Gacy thrived in a world that trusted authority figures like clowns, businessmen, and political contributors. This is why he specifically used some of these vehicles to make his impact. This trust isn't inherently bad, but how do we reconcile it with the need to question power structures? It's pretty difficult, and it's a balance, right? We can't live in constant suspicion, but at the same time, blind trust enables predators like Gacy. Brian, for you, you've worked in policy. How do you think communities can balance this need for safety and skepticism?
That's an interesting question. I think the main way that it can be done is open communication, having meetings in the community. They clearly need the police department to keep them safe. They need the firefighters out there putting out fires. They need these institutional organizations for the safety and security of their neighborhoods. But I think you still have to be skeptical all the time. We've talked about it in the past. We didn't have this back in Atlanta, but here in North Carolina, most of the surrounding municipalities use unmarked police cars to do traffic stops and write speeding tickets. And I've said it so many times going down the road, I wouldn't stop for that car if it were midnight and I was on a back road and I was a lady by myself. I'm not pulling over for that car because it doesn't look like a marked police car. So I think there's always got to be that skepticism, but I think it can be combated with open lines of communication from places like the police department. I think police officers going out, I did this a lot in a lot of my positions at Atlanta. I would go to community meetings. I became a face that people recognized in these community meetings with a voice that represented the police department. Could I have exploited that in that position of power within the community? If I were one of these people, absolutely, I could have done that. So you have to be very careful with that. Ultimately, I think it's a really tough balance.
Yeah, that balance is definitely tricky. For me, I think that it's taking skepticism, which we should all maintain a healthy level of it. It's taking that initial skepticism and tampering the emotions that typically come with it. So typically, your initial onset of skepticism is going to come with a heavy dose of emotions, right? An intense amount of maybe anger or confusion or frustration. So not necessarily removing or changing anything about the skepticism, but it's tampering those emotions so that you can channel that skepticism in healthy ways. I think the community meetings are a great example where people are able to process some of that initial skepticism prior to maybe a meeting. Once a meeting's scheduled, they know that it's on the docket for discussion. They know they have an opportunity to explore this narrative and express some of their thoughts and concerns. So there's an ease and an ability where they can process some of those initial emotions that might be a little too intense to really productively channel or use. Then they're able to ask better questions or offer better input. So it's a tricky balance. I think that we both agree on that. Let's transition a bit and discuss the intersection of vulnerability and victimhood, because that's coming up each week and was yet again prevalent here in the Gacy case. For me, working in a neighborhood filled with sex work and drug activity, I saw firsthand how predators exploit desperation. Gacy's ability to lure victims speaks to the systematic failures that leave people exposed. So the real question here is, how do we fix this? Because it's one thing to arrest a predator, but it's another to fix the root cause: poverty, isolation, lack of support. Those are harder battles. They're more systematic. They're more widespread. They're not isolated to this specific monster that we're discussing in one single case. For example, when you're responding to calls, a 911 call, in my experience, you can see the cycle playing out in real time. But it's frustrating because arresting one person doesn't stop it. And this was a frustration I experienced a lot because, surprise, no one wants you to know, but there is a point system with policing. There are things, actions, and behaviors, i.e. arrests and citations, that the institution pushes and wants you to deliver. Oftentimes, arresting one person or writing that one citation is not dealing with some of these broader root issues that we need to look at, not only as police officers, but as community members as well. And sociologically, Gacy's victims were isolated by several of these things, like poverty, societal stigma, or a lack of familiar support. So it's a reminder that crime doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's shaped by the structures around us.
I saw this as an administrator in the youth detention facility. I dealt with teens who were one bad decision away from becoming victims or perpetrators. Gacy's victims were often young men seeking work for their independence. It makes me wonder, how much of this vulnerability is systematic, created by society that leaves young people unsupported? When you're managing a facility full of teens, you see how easily the cracks in the system push them towards danger. It's not always a personal failing. Sometimes it's structural. Dani, did you see that in the neighborhoods where you worked? Did you see those people that were falling through those same cracks?
Yeah, without a doubt. I'm pretty sure both of us or any police officer, especially one that works primarily as a beat cop, can think of those 911 calls that are incessant. The same ones that come up day in and day out, the same problems. Like I said, writing one ticket or making one arrest is not going to fix. So I think they're prevalent throughout our societies. I think that this is a lesson, some good conversation and discourse that can be applied to most of our spaces, whether it be our personal, more intimate spaces within families and households, as well as our broader community spaces that all of us find ourselves interacting in.
Let's move into the psychology of this double life. Gacy's ability to juggle his public persona as a civic leader as well as his private monstrosities is unnervingly calculated. It reminds me of how many criminals in the juvenile system could compartmentalize their behaviors. Is this a learned survival mechanism, or is it pure sociopathy? When you see kids in a detention center acting one way with their peers and then another way with the staff, you realize how people learn to adapt to their surroundings. Gacy took this to the absolute extreme. When you were doing your community policing, did you encounter people that were living dual lives, upstanding on the surface, but hiding something darker?
Yeah, without a doubt. It actually makes me think of a really funny and slightly entertaining story. So we'll see if Brian keeps this in the final edit. Do you remember an individual by the name of Rob?
I do remember Rob, yes.
Okay, so some backstory, and keep me on track here, Brian. Step in when you need to so I don't ramble. Initially, I came in contact with this individual on a 911 call about something, I can't even remember now, something in his neighborhood. It was real stupid, just a typical 911 call about a suspicious vehicle or maybe a suspicious person or something like that. Responded to this 911 call. There was really not much to it, but typical me, I enjoyed getting involved and looking at it critically and asking some additional questions and making contact with the caller and really trying to get to the, like we've talked about, the root cause. I could immediately tell this was the type of call I did not want to have to be dealing with on a weekly basis. So I thought I had two options, which was either do some basic kind of investigative work, pull the call in and move on, and then I was going to have to deal with this again next week, if not sooner. Or I could actually make contact with the caller and try to figure out what's going on. Is there a deeper issue that this caller has? Is there a systemic concern? Or are they just batshit crazy? Introduce Rob. So I made contact with him. At surface level, he seemed completely sane. He seemed like he was just a concerned citizen. This was a while back, so this was before working from home was as prevalent. He worked from home and had a rarer opportunity than most people have now to actually keep an eye on his neighborhood and what's going on. And he had seen I'll give it to him, some suspicious behavior that he wanted to bring to our attention. A couple days later, I was doing some more community policing on a park and walk, walking through an outdoor shopping center mall area. Who was outside the Starbucks having some coffee? Rob. And who stopped me while I was walking to try to talk to me like we were friends? Rob. Of course, I was at work in uniform, had to maintain some level of professionalism, which is typically not something I'm good at. Win for me here. I smoozed a little bit with Rob. After that, there were just months of me running into Rob or seeing Rob in the community. I'll say a professional friendship is what developed. At some point in time, you were out on a park and walk with me. Rob stopped us and said hello, and then I introduced you to him. I thought Rob might have had a thing for me, and I was a little anxious as to where that might go. So I thought, oh, great opportunity. Let me introduce Brian and stop this in its tracks, right? We all have that horror story of the coworker who got a little bit too intimate or too close with us. This was Rob. After months of what seemed like a completely sane, slightly over concerned, I was driving through his neighborhood towards the end of my shift. So it was probably 9:45 or so at night. It was dark. It was cold. It was in the winter. I remember that. And I was just waiting for my shift to end, hoping that nothing would come up. I'm cruising down the street in my patrol car, and I hear what sounds like a wild ass banshee of a scream. I'm like, what the fuck? So I roll down my windows a little bit, and I'm trying to figure out and discern what's going on, because I'm like, oh, great. The last thing I need is for something crazy to pop off right now. I hear what sounds like footsteps, like heavy footsteps, almost as if someone's not quite running, but walking faster than just a normal walk and pace. And I'm like, I look in my rearview mirror. Rob was a huge guy, right? How tall, how much do you think he weighed?
Oh, God, he was at least 6'3", 6'4", 220 pounds.
Yeah, so late at night, my brake lights light up this figure carrying an axe. And I'm talking like full on, not like City of Atlanta, like a little idiot. I'm talking like Wild Woodsman axe.
We're not talking about a hatchet. We're talking about an axe.
Yeah. And he is running, keeping pace with my car. I'm cruising through the neighborhood, so it's faster than a walk, not quite like a sprint. He is keeping pace with my patrol vehicle and swinging this axe and screaming as if he is fucking insane. I didn't know it was Rob, obviously, right away. First thing I noticed before I figure out it's Rob, the individual is not necessarily clothed appropriately to be in public running through the streets in the middle of winter. He's in his underwear. I'm like, what in the hell? So I get on our secondary radio, of course, send off a message to my work buddy, and I'm like, dude, you've got to get over here and see this. I don't know what's going on here. So that's an example of, a long-winded example, of these dual lives of what at first looks like this sweet, charming, concerned citizen turned manic, crazed. It was drugs, and just for the kicker, it was induced by drugs, but this drug-induced giant running after a police officer in a neighborhood. While I did not turn a blind eye to this axe-yielding individual, in my time as a beat cop, I did work with communities that often turned a blind eye to certain behaviors, sometimes out of fear and other times out of complacency. Gacy's case makes me wonder how many red flags were ignored because he seemed harmless. It's like people don't want to believe evil could be that close to home, so they convince themselves that it's not happening. Culturally, we're taught not to pry into our neighbors' lives. But at what cost? Gacy exploited that exact reluctance, and it's a chilling reminder of how predators weaponize social norms. It's the cultural silence that enables predators like Gacy. When no one asks questions, they get away with murder, literally. Brian, do you think social norms around privacy make it harder for communities to hold people accountable? What are your thoughts on the role of community blindness?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a factor because we live in a society nowadays. You used to know your neighbors, right? You could go over to your neighbors and ask them for the proverbial cup of sugar for your baking. That is a rare thing nowadays. I know it still happens. We're friends with one of our neighbors up the street, and we know a couple of other neighbors. We're in a different situation. We live on 40 acres in the middle of nowhere, so our neighbors are fewer and far between. But I think it's the same way now. We make fun of the Karens, they're called, right? The Karens and the Kevins of the world. We love to laugh at those videos. But the Karens and the Kevins of the world that are in everybody's business are, in my opinion, the perfect people to help catch people like John Wayne Gacy and Jeffrey Dahmer, you name the serial killer, because they do get involved in other people's lives. But I do think that those societal norms that have shifted to a very private place for most people does hinder that greatly, because nobody's really sticking their nose in their neighbor's business. Look, there were a lot of red flags with Gacy. He had several arrests in the past for sexually abusing younger boys, and people in the community knew about it, but they didn't talk about it. And I think that was another layer to that, not wanting to get involved, not spreading gossip. I think it definitely hinders cases like Gacy's and so many more that have happened over the years, and unfortunately that will play out sometime in the future.
Yeah, great points. I want to talk briefly about the role of gender and masculinity in Gacy's crimes. The shame Gacy experienced around his sexuality is palpable in his crimes. Growing up in a homophobic environment, he channeled that self-loathing into violence against young men. It's heartbreaking and horrifying. The intersection of repression and violence is something I saw a lot in the community I serve. Gacy's case magnifies that on a terrifying scale, and I personally think it's tragic how often shame turns into hatred towards oneself or others. If we take a moment to look at this from a sociological perspective, Gacy's case reflects broader societal issues. For example, how repression, stigma, or toxic masculinity intersect to create environments ripe for violence. When society teaches men to equate power with dominance, it creates a breeding ground for harm. And Gacy is an extreme example of just that. What do you think, Brian? Do you think today's conversations about masculinity and vulnerability would have changed Gacy's trajectory?
I'm not sure that it would have changed his trajectory, but like you said, Gacy's father was horrible. He mocked him. He called him a sissy, called him mama's boy, constantly reinforcing that toxic masculinity. As a former administrator in a youth detention facility, I saw how those ideas shaped young men's behaviors in very destructive ways. Gacy's crimes reflect that obsession with power, control, dominance. They're traits that society has mistakenly tied to masculinity, and it's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous combination when you mix that toxic masculinity, you mix those early issues with his father, his own struggles with the sexuality, with his already fragile psyche, some of the things he had going on psychologically. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. Unfortunately, at least 33 young men and boys lost their lives because of it.
I think what's really unfortunate is beyond just this specific case or specific to extreme outbursts of violence or aggression like we see with Gacy, masculinity, specifically toxic masculinity, is so pervasive throughout our culture and society. Something that is not isolated to these extremes. It's something that impacts so many complicated, deep, and dynamic areas of all of our unique experience, in my personal opinion.
Let's get into the power of the media in shaping the public's perception. Gacy's trial was one of the first high-profile cases to play out in the media spotlight. Having worked in policy, I know how public opinion can influence law enforcement priorities. The media's framing of Gacy as the killer clown amplified that horror, and it also shaped his legacy. The media isn't just reporting on these cases. They're shaping the story, and with Gacy, they turned him into a symbol of pure fear. How do you think the media impacts victims and how they're remembered in cases like this?
Great question. I think the media sensationalizes and focuses so much on the aggressor or the perpetrator because that's where all of the fear, the sensationalizing drama of it is contained. So oftentimes victims or other characters involved in the story or the narrative are not explored or not given, in my opinion, the proper acknowledgement, attention they deserve, because quite frankly, they're not the forces that are driving what sells in media, which is fear, right? So the viewer, someone outside the case, often is bombarded with mostly the fear behind this predator. And it does a disservice not only to the case and the victims, but I think that it's also a roadblock in others outside of this narrow tunnel vision of a singular case. It prevents people outside of that from being involved in the conversations and thus involved in the solutions.
That's one of the reasons that when we started the show, particularly my episode is very victim focused. I never want to sensationalize or lift up the perpetrator in these cases. We always say the names of the victims. Oftentimes at the end of or towards the end of my episode, I will go down the list of victims and just say their names because I want the focus to be on them, because that's truly what these cases are all about. Everybody wants to read the headlines of what John Wayne Gacy did, what Jeffrey Dahmer did, insert the serial killer. That's what sells papers. That's what gets the clicks on the internet. But at the end of the day, for people like us who do these kinds of shows, I think by and large, the majority of us are very focused on the victim, and we never want to lose sight of that in the show. Even though we might have some levity here and there, we might have a little fun at the expense of the case file, but we never lose sight of the fact that we are very much focused on the victims because they are the ones that we do the show for.
Completely appreciate you taking the time to acknowledge that. And I definitely agree with your sentiment. Full disclosure, I appreciate you taking on that work because no one wants to hear me try to say names. For almost 38 years now, it gives me so much anxiety. Anytime I think about having to say names or read names in any situation, I immediately panic because I butcher it, absolutely butcher it. So I agree with the sentiment.
Say it right now. Say Conorak synthesome phone.
Conorak synthesome phone.
See, you do it better than me.
That's because I practice behind the scenes. There are several key words, and we actually have personal friends and family members who have actually asked us or encouraged us to keep some of the words that I say incorrectly into my shows because it's hilarious. I say words, some words, a specific few select words incorrectly. The running joke is I can butcher it, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's usually entertaining and worth it. And I can actually trace it back to, it's got to be something in my genes, right? It's not a lack of intelligence or ability because my father was a preacher. I still have some of his old recordings of his sermons, which is something I treasure and listen to often. It's a running joke that if you bring up my father to anyone who knew him, one of the first, I would say, top 3 things they will share about him is how he butchered and made up his own version of words, but yet no one really ever picked up on it. You can listen to his sermons and actually see it in real time play out, and it is hilarious.
Yeah, your mother does it too, so you get it honest. It's on both sides.
Yeah, every year, we look for the one Christmas gift of Brian's out of the 10 or 15 every year where my mom writes brain to brain from Mom and Pumbaa. It's hilarious. Speaking of hilarious and entertaining, let's take a brief moment. We're going to play a game. By we, Brian and I, and at our expense, hopefully you will be entertained. I came up with the game called Crime Cast Fantasy Draft. Brian, why don't you introduce it?
All right, here we go with Crime Cast Fantasy Draft. Dani and I are going to be stepping into the ring to assemble the ultimate crime team. But here's the twist. We're drafting characters not from reality, but from fiction, history, and maybe a bit of chaos.
That's right. And this week, in honor of John Wayne Gacy, our draft has a crime-solving flair with a side of absurdity. Here's how it works. Each of us will pick a team, role by role, and then put our team crew to the test in a crime scenario. Think of it as Ocean's 11 meets Clue meets, let's just be honest, utter madness.
We're going to go 3 rounds of drafting, followed by a wild card twist, because what's crime without unpredictability? We'll each defend our choices and let you, our dear listeners, decide on who built the better team. All right, Dani, are you ready to lose?
Please. I've been emotionally preparing for this my whole life, so bring it on, Brian.
Ooh.
Round 1, the draft.
Okay, let's kick things off here with a coin toss to decide who drafts first. It's going to be heads or tails. Dani, you call it.
All right, heads.
All right, heads it is.
Ooh.
Means you get to choose.
All right, our first category this week is mastermind. These characters are known for intelligence, strategic thinking, or manipulation. Let's look at our masterminds. We have 30 that we can choose from. I am going to go with, if there is ever an X-Men up for grabs, I'm definitely grabbing them. So my mastermind of the week is going to be Professor X Xavier from the X-Men, for those of you who are not familiar.
All right, that's a solid pick. That's respectful. I'm going to go with another, what I believe to be a more solid pick in Walter White from Breaking Bad. One of my favorite characters ever. He's a badass. If you guys have never seen Breaking Bad, you need to go watch it right now. But yeah, I'm going with Walter White.
All right. Oh, here's a question. What do you like better, Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul as a series, as a whole?
Oh, Better Call Saul.
I haven't watched it. All right. Interesting choice. For our second category this week, we are going to go with muscle. So these characters are known for physical strength, intimidation, or possibly some combat skills. I am going to go with... so I'm not necessarily a huge fan of these movies. I'm going to pick it just to cause you to stumble a little bit because I know this is someone you love. I'm going with Rambo.
Ooh, I love Rambo, and I would have probably picked Rambo myself.
Got him.
But I'm going to do the next best thing. I think I'm going to go with Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator.
Ooh, good choice. I actually really like him as Mr. Freeze in the Batman. That's my pop culture reference frame for him. All right, fair play. Good choice. Our third category is going to be Tech Wizard. So these characters are known for hacking, building, or technological expertise. Sorry, I was tripping up on that and needed to sound it out. So let's look at our list. I need to round out my team because this is our last pick. I am going to go with... all right, we'll see how I can make this work. I'm going to go with Sandra Bullock. Our reference here is from The Net. I'm assuming that's a movie. I'm not actually familiar with that reference, but we all know who Sandra Bullock is. I think of Miss Congeniality. So she's going to bring some tech, even though I don't think she has any tech skills in that movie and in my reference, but we'll see how it works. Maybe it'll go in your favor. All right, your choice.
Oh, it's definitely going in my favor. I am a Gen X kid. I grew up with MacGyver, so I am definitely going 100% MacGyver for the tech.
Nice. All right, so round 2, this is where we are going to introduce the scenario. Now that we built our teams, it's time for the scenario challenge. This week's scenario is called The Stolen Crown Jewels. In this crime scenario, the royal family discovers their priceless crown jewels have been replaced with cheap replicas during a high-security gala. Surveillance cameras mysteriously malfunctioned during the heist, leaving no immediate suspects. Each team's goal is to infiltrate the high-security compound to retrieve these priceless artifacts before the rival team does. We've got 2 minutes each to explain how our team would dominate. Since I read the scenario challenge, hopefully, Brian, you were putting together your team's strategic approach. So you get to go first.
Yeah, I definitely wasn't doing that, but it's going to be easy. My team is built for precision and brute force, so we're going to figure it out as we go.
Oh.
Yeah, the first thing I'm going to do is have a conversation with MacGyver and say, what can you invent to help get us in here? Because we got to have a way to break our way into this. I'm going to send my man, the Terminator, in first as the muscle. I forgot who the other fucking person I picked was in the beginning for my brains. Who did I pick for the...
Walter White, Breaking Bad.
Yeah, so I'm going to send my muscle in. I'm sending in the Terminator to just bust down the door if we have to. And I'm going to have Walter there. He can intimidate anybody that needs to be intimidated on the inside. He's going to figure it out from there. He's got the tools. He's got the team that he needs. I don't know what else to say. Go ahead.
I don't think Brian is enjoying this as much as I am, ladies and gentlemen. This is the entertaining part. A side note, you're not good at games in any way, shape, or form, whether it's card games, video games, or board games. You're a good sport, and at the expense of you, our listeners are hopefully being entertained. All right, my approach. Let's see. I'm going to actually take a different approach than you. Strategically, I'm going to start with Sandra Bullock. Let's see. It's a gala, so I'm going to have her dress up since she got her training in Miss Congeniality, I'm going to have her dress up, look absolutely stunning, make an entrance. While she is distracting everyone with her poise, beauty, and charm, I am going to send in Professor X. He'll be unassuming. He can use his mind reading and mind control techniques to distract anyone who might actually pick up on what he's doing. So he's going to steal the jewels, and then I am going to bring in Rambo at the end as my muscle to help escort Professor X and Sandra Bullock out of the gala. He can provide muscle if necessary, make sure that my two leading characters with the jewels get out. So you've now heard our strategic approaches and our teams. Round 3 is the wild card round. Brian, you're just ready for this to be over, aren't you?
Yes, totally.
Okay, so the twists of all twists. I'm going to draw my wild card. This wild card is added to our team, and we have to come up with a strategic approach for how we would have utilized them with our team and our strategy. Make sense? All right, my wild card is cat with a GoPro. All right, I'll make this work. The cat is going to become my surveillance expert, sneaking through vents to give us a live feed of every room and work with Sandra Bullock and Professor X to snag these jewels without being discovered. Boom. That's an adaptability at its best. All right, Brian, you up.
My wild card is Dorothy Zvornak from The Golden Girls. Dorothy is going to go in and throw shade at everybody, guarding the jewels. She's going to make them laugh. The rest of my team is going to swoop in and steal whatever they want.
All right. So you have heard our teams, the scenario, and our wild cards, and now it's your turn. Who do you think built the better crime-solving dream team? Are you Team Dani or Team Brian?
Team Dorothy.
Yeah.
If you don't like the Golden Girls, there's something wrong with it.
While you're at it, let us know what your draft picks would have been in the categories of Mastermind, Muscle, and Tech Wizard. We're dying to hear your combinations, especially if they're more creative than Brian.
Let's get into some of the modern perils and relevance as related to the Gacy case. How does the Gacy case tie into modern crime solving, and what does it teach us about where we've been and where we're going in law enforcement? Cases like Gacy's didn't just shock the public. They forced changes in policies and procedures and even the way that we think about catching criminals and predators like Gacy. For example, one of the biggest challenges back then was communication, or the lack thereof, between police departments. Gacy obviously exploited those cracks. Today, we have advances like databases and real-time information sharing with systems like the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, that make it harder for predators like him to stay under the radar. But here's the kicker. Imagine Gacy's crimes happening in an era of social media and modern surveillance. Every move he made would have been tracked, analyzed, and probably live streamed by some bystander. This combination of cameras on every corner and the public's obsession with true crime would have likely exposed him much sooner. And yet, we also face ethical dilemmas. Does constant surveillance trade our safety for privacy? What is your take on how society today would handle a figure like John Wayne Gacy?
I'm glad you brought up social media because Gacy's story highlights something deeper. It highlights how societal stigmas can make people vulnerable. Back then, his victims were often young men from marginalized backgrounds, runaways, struggling with homelessness, or dealing with issues tied to their sexuality. These weren't just random targets. They were people society had already failed to see or protect long before Gacy got involved. And let's not forget Gacy's double life. By day, he was a business owner and a community leader. That facade gave him a shield of normalcy that predators still use today. Think about how many stories we hear now where the predator was described as the nicest guy or the pillar of the community. The truth is, societal norms often protect those who present as successful while overlooking red flags. But here's the silver lining. Today, victim advocacy has come a long way. Organizers are more equipped to support survivors and amplify their voices, making it harder for predators to operate in silence. It's a step in the right direction, but cases like Gacy's remind us how much more work we still have to do. You brought up a great point, Brian, with technological advances and policy changes. Talk about that a little bit more.
Talk about what?
It's a good example of slurring, which I couldn't do this week.
Jesus Christ. I think one of the big differences is the advancements in communication. In the 1970s, Gacy moved freely between jurisdictions because police departments didn't communicate as well. But today we have all those tools like the criminal databases, interagency task forces that talk to each other on a regular basis. You've got the centralized record systems. There's all kinds of things that would have flagged some of these patterns that were going on with Gacy at the time. Do you think there are systemic improvements like those that would have helped prevent Gacy from staying under the radar, or would the societal blind spots still let him slip through the cracks?
Fair question. Societal blind spots obviously would still have an impact on this case as well as any other cases. But I think you make a great point. If we're trying to look at patterns, obviously the more information we have, the better we're going to be able to not only find these patterns, but the quicker we'll be able to find these patterns. So yeah, I think that when you have multiple agencies or databases and pieces of information coming together, then you're going to increase the speed and the likelihood at which you would find some of these patterns and hopefully be able to interrupt someone like Gacy earlier on in their trajectory.
One thing that strikes me the most is how much law enforcement has evolved, but also how much this case still feels relevant today. Whether it's technology, communication, or the way we view predators in general, there's still lessons to be learned.
Absolutely. For me, it's a reminder that while we've made strides in understanding psychology and supporting victims, we're still fighting the same battles against stigma and indifference. The fact that many of Gacy's victims were young men dealing with stigma around homelessness or their sexuality shows how predators exploit societal indifference. Even today, marginalized communities face higher risks because of systematic neglect.
As always, we want to know what you guys think. Send us an email, leave us a voicemail, let us know what modern tools and attitudes you think would have stopped Gacy sooner. And what societal gaps do you think that still need to be filled to stop predators like him today?
Yeah, let us know your thoughts. And if you got ideas for how you would have solved this case or maybe another case like it with modern tools, we'd love to hear them. It's time for one of our favorite closing games. Although we've never played this before, we're going to see what happens. So to close out today's co-hosted episode,
It's our favorite, but we've never done
of the Guilty Files. This is where we dig up some of the strangest historical crimes or behaviors and debate whether the person was guilty of something truly sinister or maybe out there doing the weirdest version of living their best life.
It's exactly like the true crime version of Would You Rather, but with fewer existential dilemmas and more of what were you thinking moments. And in honor of this week's case, all of our picks tie back to one theme: clowns, quirky parties, and questionable behavior.
All right, so scenario 1 is a man dressed as a clown robs a bank, but instead of fleeing, he leaves behind balloons with phrases like "smile" and "have a nice day" written on them. He's caught when the dye pack in his bag explodes at a children's birthday party. He's performing later that afternoon. All right, Brian, what's your take? Guilty or just odd?
Honestly, I think the guy's just odd. It's given a low-budget Joker energy, but his chaotic positivity feels like he was just trying to make a statement. He might have wanted to rob the bank, but he also wanted everybody to have a great day, so can we really call that guilty?
No, this guy is straight up guilty. He's a menace to balloon animals everywhere, and if you're dumb enough to carry dye-stained cash into a gig as a clown, you're too guilty and too, frankly, in my opinion, stupid. He's too guilty. Book him.
All right, next scenario, the clown wedding crashers. At a small-town wedding reception, 2 clowns crashed the event, claiming that they were hired by the bride. The clowns perform an over-the-top act, including sword swallowing, juggling fire, and loudly narrating the couple's first dance. It's only after the cake is cut that the bride admits she didn't hire them.
Definitely odd. No laws technically were broken, except maybe the law of good taste. If the clowns were good at their act, I'd call it free entertainment for the guests. And let's face it, with a wedding expense and budget, free entertainment is always a win. But if they ate half the cake and scared grandma, we might have to reconsider.
Odd. That's practically felony level cringe. Who just shows up and hijacks someone's wedding? Unless their whole act was a social commentary on marriage being a circus, which I doubt. This feels oddly sinister. I'm leaning on guilty.
All right. Thanks for sticking with us, folks. Let's wrap it up with our last scenario, the party planner with a twist. A party planner organizes elaborate events in people's backyards, promising guests a once-in-a-lifetime experience. However, after each event, the host's shed, like their outdoor shed, mysteriously goes missing, transported to the planner's private collection of backyard structures. Oh, this is giving me like a Storage Wars vibes. All right, so what's your take?
Okay, this one's hilarious, definitely odd. Imagine inviting someone over to plan your kid's birthday party, only to find out they're a shed thief. Weirdly impressive. Yes, guilty. Only if the sheds were vintage.
I like that twist. All right, I'm going to call this guilty. How do you even justify that in court, Brian? Your Honor, I only took the shed because it completed my backyard aesthetic. This guy belongs in the lockup for backyard bandits for sure. Thievery at its best. Guilty.
Those are some of the wildest examples yet. I thought Gacy's clown act was horrifying, but these stories definitely gave me something new to lose sleep over.
It's amazing what passes as odd until someone says it. Wait, isn't that illegal? Anyway, if you have your own bizarre crimes for us to debate, DM us on any of our social medias or comment. We would love to add your suggestions to our list for future episodes.
As we wrap up this deep dive into one of the darkest chapters in true crime history, let's take a moment to reflect on what Gacy's case teaches us about our systems and ourselves. For me, the big takeaway is this. Progress in law enforcement and policy is only as good as our ability to learn from our past failures. The Gacy case exposed so many gaps in communication between police departments, blind spots in how we view certain communities, and the danger of underestimating people who hide behind the mask of normalcy. These lessons lead to changes in profiling, interagency communication, interagency cooperation, and even forensics. What about you? What's sticking with you from this case?
For me, Brian, it's the emotional weight of this case. It's not just about the crimes themselves, but about the ripple effects they leave behind. The victims, their families, and even the communities that lived in fear during Gacy's reign of terror. What stands out most is how much of this comes back to vulnerability and trust. Gacy targeted people who were already struggling, runaways, young men trying to make ends meet, or those wrestling with their identities. He knew how to exploit trust and manipulate a system that wasn't built to protect them. And that's the lesson we still haven't fully learned today, how to better protect people society tends to overlook. But here's the hopeful part. While talking about this, true crime fans, podcasts like ours, and advocates all over the world are shining a light into these dark corners, refusing to let these stories be forgotten. That's how we change things, by remembering the victims and pushing for a better system. One conversation at a time.
I can't believe I'm actually saying this, but I actually agree with you. It's rare, so mark the date.
Wait, did we just have a moment? Don't get too comfortable, Brian. I'm saving this for blackmail material later. It's time-stamped and documented, and it's live in the world.
I'm sure you will. But seriously, this is what we do. We dig into these cases and uncover lessons, spark conversations, and maybe, just maybe, make the world a little bit more aware one episode at a time.
Exactly. Now, we want to hear from you, our listeners. What do you think the Gacy case teaches us about vulnerability, trust, or the systems meant to protect us? Are there gaps you think still exist today? Or maybe you have your own thoughts on how true crime can lead to change. Drop us a comment, DM us, or share your take on social media.
And hey, let's settle the real debate. whose team would have solved or committed the crime faster in our crime cast fantasy draft? Team Brian's Dorothy from the Golden Girls or Team Dani's GoPro Cat? We'll post the poll right here after the episode, so don't forget to vote.
Also, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to leave a review, share it with your fellow true crime fans, and tune in next week when we dive into another case. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and maybe double check your cross base just in case.
And remember, whether it's a cold case or a current one, the key to justice is never letting the story end. Thanks for joining us here on The Guilty Files. We'll see you next time.